So just a couple sentences of background. A colleague and I are writing a book about strategy in organizing and social change, and we're doing a variety of case studies about different approaches. One of them is going to be about approaches that center caregiving, mutual aid. It's called different things, and so GMHC will be the kind of lead case study for that. My colleague Olivia, maybe you want to introduce yourself, who's working with us on the book.
Yeah. Hey, David. Thanks for taking the time. I'm Olivia. I write and do research and do documentary films. So I've been helping with sort of the background research for Deepak and Stephanie for this book. And I think the most valuable and interesting and wonderful parts of it have been talking to people like you and getting these anecdotes. So excited to have this conversation.
So yeah, any questions for us, David? On what
Sure, I'm looking forward to it.
Sorry, go ahead.
I'm looking forward to the conversation. I like this conversation, so I'm happy to have it.
Good. Well, so let's dive in. So can you just tell us a little bit about yourself, situate yourself for us before GMHC, after, what you're up to now?
Sure. So before GMHC, well, I'm a native New Yorker, grew up in Brooklyn, and was an actor at some point in my early life, and then ended up in law school. And I ended up in law school at CUNY Law School, which was a pretty radical place to go to law school, and all centered around public interest law. And my interest in going to law school was to sort of put my political ideas into some practice. And so CUNY was a good place for me. And while I was there, I was very fortunate to start working on some gay rights litigation, interning at the Center for Constitutional Rights and the ACLU, where I was at the Reproductive Freedom Project for a while. And the ACLU building, Lambda Legal Defense Fund, was housed in the ACLU building at the time. This was 1984, 85. And I was an intern at the Reproductive Freedom Project, and started hanging out at Lambda and making friends with them. And Tim Sweeney was the executive director at Lambda. It was really small, right? It was the leading national lesbian and gay litigation organization, and but it was the 4 people. And so Tim was the executive director, and I just started hanging out there, and then started doing volunteer work for them. And the first thing they had, and it was 84, 85, so AIDS was already an issue, but things were moving very quickly. And so the very first thing I did at Lambda was work on Lambda's effort to delay the licensing of the HIV test, because there were no provisions yet put in place to protect people from discrimination and misuse of the test results. So we wanted to delay the licensing of the test until some protection could be put in place. That effort failed. The test was licensed, and very soon after, Lambda started getting calls from attorneys around the country. I have a client who got fired from his job. I got a client who got thrown out of his house. I got a client who was thrown out of a restaurant, who was turned away for healthcare. And we were getting all of these different, plus there were also sort of legislative moves to quarantine in Texas, marriage license, mandatory testing for a marriage license in Illinois. So we were just getting all of these calls, and I was the law student. I was answering the phone. So I was kind of the first line. And so I just started documenting all of these calls, and it turned into a newsletter. And it was really the first AIDS legal newsletter that we sent out around the country, just to let people know where the cases were developing, what was going on, what strategies were attorneys using to address the problems, because it was all so very new. So I did that, and then I went away and I finished law school and clerked for a judge for a little while. And then and by then, Tim had left Lambda and had moved to GMHC. But I got a call from the folks at Lambda saying they were creating 2 new staff attorney positions solely focused on AIDS. And was I interested in one of them? So, I immediately said yes, and went on staff at Lambda. And the other position was a litigation position. My position was really about policy, which was good because I wouldn't have been a good litigator. But I was good at the policy work. And so that's how I got involved in AIDS work sort of professionally. And stayed at Lambda for, I don't know, 2 years. Yeah, about 2 years. And then Tim called and said they were creating a new position of like assistant director of policy at GMHC, and did I want to come over there? So, if Tim Sweeney calls, you answer. And so I said, yeah, of course. And so I went over, and that's how I got to GMHC. So I started at GMHC in 1990, and I was there for about 7 years. And I left GMHC. I'm sorry, I'm going on too long. You're going to have to tell me when to stop talking because I talk a lot. I left GMHC in 97 to start something called the Forum for Collaborative HIV Research at George Washington University, which was an HIV sort of research policy think tank, and ran that for a number of years, came back to New York, and then got involved in 2002. I got involved with a group of activists from around the world, and we started a coalition of global treatment activists. And I'll get into the treatment stuff in a minute, called the International Treatment Preparedness Coalition. And I ran that for the next 10 years or so. And that was pretty exciting and successful. And then since 2011, 2012, I've really been working freelance for community organizations, international NGOs around the world. I've done a lot of work on funding. I've worked for a lot of foundations, some work for the Global Fund, Gates Foundation, UN, et cetera. And now I'm still doing some of that work, but I've really pulled back, and so I'm doing a lot less. And I moved out of New York City, and we live in the Catskills. Maybe I just finished this long thing with. I've worked on a lot of different areas in HIV over like many years: stigma, discrimination, prevention, funding. But really the bulk of the work has been around access to treatment. And in the beginning years, that involved clinical research, drug development, drug approval, because there was no treatment. So that was the first stage of treatment advocacy, was to get treatment to exist. And then it turned into, once we had some treatment, it was how do we get the treatment to people who need it the most. And that was really the focus of the international stuff. Okay, that's a good place to stop. You're on mute.
Yep, sorry about that. So let's talk a little bit about your role at GMHC. So were you policy director there? What kind of work did you do? Yeah.
So I had two positions at GMHC. First, I was the assistant director of policy. And so GMHC had a policy department that was working on local, state, and national levels. There were three of us when I got there. There were 7 or 8 of us by the time I left. But halfway through my time at GMHC, I moved and I became the director of a new department called Treatment Education and Advocacy, which focused specifically on treatment advocacy issues, but also education issues. So it was a combination of services and advocacy in one department. And that was my focus. When I got to GMHC, the position the assistant director of policy position was a new position. And so there was no, it wasn't like I was coming in and taking on a portfolio of work. It was a new position, and I created a portfolio of work sort of based on what I thought was important and where the opportunities were. And I did a bunch of different things, but I really was building off of the work I'd started to do at Lambda. So treatment was a major focus of my work throughout the time at GMHC. And maybe I can just to add, I started at Lambda in, I don't know, probably around March of 1987. ACT UP started in March of 1987. I went to my first ACT UP meeting that June and became a very, very active member of ACT UP. So I was always wearing sort of several hats and bridging between these organizations, both at Lambda and at GMHC.
Super excited to explore that bridging role that you played.
Yeah.
Maybe one other thing about GMHC first in your time there. So just in both those roles, what was like your day-to-day? What did you do? What was a typical kind of set of work you might be doing on the policy side or on the treatment advocacy? What kinds of things would you be pushing for and so forth?
Well, my day was basically going from meeting to meeting, whether that be, internal staff meetings or external meetings. The lines between, and particularly in the first bunch of years, because when I was in the policy department, so there was just a lot of that. There was a lot of talk, and but my focus is, was so much around treatment advocacy work that I was deeply involved with the FDA and the National Institutes of Health and the pharmaceutical industry. And so not all of my time, there were other issues I worked on in terms of city-based stuff, the development of the Ryan White Planning Councils, things like that. But most of my time was spent on sort of clinical research and drug development issues. And so I spent a lot of time going to Washington, going to Bethesda, Maryland, and working on, first, there was a trajectory to that work that was, it was very sort of specific set of issues that were really key issues in the HIV response, but it wasn't a large group of people who were working on them. And so it was sort of very communal, that work. And it was people from GMHC, or when I was at Lambda, from Lambda, ACT UP, Project Inform in San Francisco. We were a small coalition of people sort of working on a very, kind of technical set of issues. So that was really, that was the focus. And that included, first, the beginning of it was just getting information, like, what the hell is the government doing? What's going on at the NIH? Why does it take 7 years for the FDA to approve a drug. What drugs are they considering? Just that very basic getting information, which was difficult, like what clinical trials are being conducted. NIH wouldn't give us the information. I was at Lambda, I filed the FOIA request so we could get all of the clinical trial documents. So we sort of went from that work to, okay, now we've gotten that information and we've done an analysis of it. Here's what's wrong with it. And how do we begin to change it? And that involved us eventually getting very deeply involved in the clinical research process. So, and it was really the first time that people directly affected by a disease became, involved in, not only participating in clinical trials, but developing those trials, setting the priorities for research, et cetera. And that had never happened before. So that was a lot of the time.
Thanks for that. Can you give us a feel for what life was like for you, for gay men in this period, in the kind of teeth of the AIDS crisis?
Sure. Well, the obvious thing to say is it was incredibly scary. We felt as if we were sort of living in a war zone. It was New York City, it was the epicenter of the epidemic. It really felt like living in a war zone, except that everybody I was walking past on the street, didn't really know that the war was going on. So that was kind of strange, and scared about getting sick, scared about all of my friends, getting sick, them being sick, them dying, right? It was all of that, which is, pretty obvious, I would think. But that was only part of it. There was sort of the fear and the grief and the anger. But there was also an incredible sense of camaraderie. My relationship to the gay community before I got involved in AIDS was not particularly a comfortable one. I mean, I was out, I was having some fun, but I never felt comfortable in bars. I had a steady boyfriend at a really young age, at a time when that really wasn't done. And other gay guys kind of thought we were silly. So I always kind of felt alienated from that community, but also didn't want to be alienated, and it wasn't until I really started getting involved in AIDS work, particularly when I found ACT UP, that I found a home and I found a real sense of community for the first time. So, in addition to the horror, there was all of this. Joy is a really weird word, but not inappropriate, because I felt sort of protected for the first time.
That's really powerful. If we can just stay with that for a second. And was it the feeling of being, what was it that provided that joy? The feeling of being in struggle with your comrade? What were the kind of things that generated that feeling of warmth, of camaraderie?
Well, some of those things I think are fairly universal to many of us that went through that experience. Just that we were all so vulnerable and scared, and then we found this place. GMHC was that place. ACT UP was that place, where you could be together and support one another and work together and have fun together. And that just helped deal with the sense of isolation and fear, it just made us stronger to be together. And for me, it was also unique in that I was raised in a household that, my parents were both community organizers in their own, each in their own way. I was raised in a very sort of leftist political, I'm a New York Jewish lefty kid, and so when I walked into that ACT UP meeting for the first time, I was like, it was the first time I was home. I walked in there and I went, oh, I've been waiting to walk into this room my entire life. I immediately felt like, oh, I understand this situation. I can be home here. Like I'd been training for this. I didn't get to GMHC until later. So I first felt that at ACT UP. It was also incredibly sexy place, to be. It was just all these beautiful, friendly gay guys, and it was very flirtatious, and it was, it was all that stuff was really much better for me than a bar where I didn't know how to make small talk, with strangers. It was, oh, I can develop these friendships and I can flirt with these guys and something might happen. And, so that there was all of that too.
Let's stay with that maybe for a little bit. So can you talk a little bit about the relationship between GMHC and ACT UP? Space, participation, money. Tim mentioned that there was financing of ACT UP you maybe were involved in. What was your role in the bridging of those things?
I don't, if Tim says that there was money from GMHC to ACT UP, then it's true, but I have no knowledge of that at all. And I'll actually check it with the person who'll know on the ACT UP side. So some of the history there that would, Olivia, did you have a question?
No, I didn't, but thank you for asking.
So the trajectory, the history of it is that in some respects, Larry Kramer was very simplistic about this, but in some respects, ACT UP was created in response to GMHC and a feeling that GMHC wasn't responding politically to the epidemic. It was there, it was providing services, but it wasn't there wasn't political action, and this required political action. So ACT UP was formed sort of in response to that. I think that there's some truth to that, but I think that's a really simplistic view and not really what happened. So the way I would frame it is the very first thing that happened when AIDS emerged, right? And we didn't even know what it was. It wasn't AIDS yet. People were getting sick very quickly and very quickly dying, and we had no idea why. And so the very first line of defense that had to be addressed was, how do we help these people in crisis? Particularly because the government wasn't really responding, and even before the government knew that there was something to respond to, people needed to figure out how to care for their friends, right? It wasn't, these were gay men, many of whom weren't with their families, right? They left their hometowns, they had moved to New York. Their families, their communities was the gay community in New York or San Francisco. And so the very first thing we had to do was respond to very basic needs. I have to take this guy to the hospital. I have to help clean up his bed. I have to buy some groceries. Like that had to be the very first thing to organize. So that was the first thing that happened. And sort of the second component of that is just trying to deal with some information flow. What's going on? What do we know? What is untrue? So, and how could you prevent whatever the hell is going on? So that sort of information dissemination and education was also part of that essential first wave of response. GMHC, that's how GMHC got created, was to meet those initial needs. There was always some advocacy going on at GMHC, but setting up those very basic services for people really had to be the first thing that had to happen. And that took some time, and it took up everybody's energy, right? Because it wasn't like, oh, I found out I was positive, and then a couple of months, years later, I got sick. This was before that time. Everybody who found out they had AIDS found out they had AIDS by getting really ill. So they needed immediate attention. So that just took up everybody's energy. There was no test, there was no virus yet, known virus. Once that initial infrastructure at GMHC was created and there was some services developing, that opened opportunity to think about, okay, what next? That's one thing. Two, it became really clear that the government was not going to step in. And so we had to respond to that. So that was sort of another factor. But maybe one of the most important factors was the development of the HIV test. And that was 1985. Because all of a sudden, we went from, we have some unknown thing and you get sick, and maybe you have it, maybe you don't. Then there was a test. And once there was a test, it meant that you had this growing population of mostly young people finding out that they were positive, but they were not sick yet. So they knew that they were in grave danger, but they were still fine, and they were right. And so they had a lot of energy. They didn't need somebody to buy them groceries and change their diapers and all that stuff. So you had this growing cadre of people who wanted response and who were motivated, and they were really angry because they didn't see their government responding. Many of them were, came from upper or middle class backgrounds, so they had a sense of privilege, and they couldn't imagine that their government was completely neglecting them, and that made them really, really angry. So that is, to me, really what led to the formation of ACT UP, that we needed another place to do that kind of mobilizing. And then there was a difference, in just style and culture. GMHC, there were people who were attracted to the community of GMHC, and there were people who were attracted to the, I don't know, are you New Yorkers?
I am, yeah.
Well, you're young, but you're not as young. So, ACT UP was East Village and GMHC was West Village, was Chelsea. If that means anything to you. I don't think it means anything anymore, but it used to mean something. It was, what kind of music did you like, and where did you hang out and stuff like that? How did you dress? So there was that cultural difference as well. But I really do think that, this idea that ACT UP was created in response and as a critique of GMHC isn't really, there's some truth to it, particularly given Larry's role in igniting, not founding, but igniting some people who became ACT UP, because that was his version. And he was angry at GMHC for everything in the world. So,
right, and it's ironic that I gather that at that meeting he charged Tim, maybe among others, to go kind of convene the space, and that the first meetings were at GMHC. So, that's kind of an ironic.
I wasn't at those very first meetings. I always thought the meetings were always at the center.
No, I think the first, well, we should verify. I should verify it, but I think the first
Yeah.
were actually at GMHC, and when Larry turned to Tim in the audience when he was ranting about GMHC and said, and you need to do something about that. So that's what I gather the origin story was. To speak to your point, and I want to stick with it a little bit because I'm curious what you think the impact of mass volunteering among gay men was from GMHC. So what you talked about kind of the impact of the AIDS crisis and creating community, but for the volunteer part in particular, like what shifts did it bring about in gay consciousness and how was that related or not to this other shift that led to ACT UP? Yeah, can you just trace like how you feel that unfolded?
Sure, but maybe before I answer that, let me
Yeah.
just add one thing to the previous, which is, yeah, I was at Lambda when I joined ACT UP. So I immediately created that bridge between ACT UP and GMA and Lambda, partially around treatment work, but first around providing legal support for demonstrations. And so I organized, in my Lambda hat, I organized lawyers to, get people out of jail, do monitoring at the demos, et cetera. And that, whatever criticism was coming towards GMHC from ACT UP, Lambda was spared all of that because we developed a relationship quickly. With GMHC, I think there were a couple of places where that bridge happened. One, whatever criticism ACT UP members were leveling at GMHC, every time anybody needs some services or some help, that's where they went. So, but GMHC got involved in treatment advocacy work, which was Lambda's issue, which was ACT UP's issue early on. And then when I went over there, that bridge happened even more so. And from that point on, there was no longer any friction, really. There was friction around events, around particular, strategies, et cetera, but there wasn't that kind of organizational friction that maybe it started with. So to go to the next question. It's a big question, right? And so there's lots of components to it. I guess where I'd start is we were faced with a total mystery that was terrifying. And we had to create everything from scratch. We were, not everybody, but there were a lot of professional gay men and gay women and straight women, but particularly the gay men who, who were lawyers, who were advertising executives, who worked in advertising and publicity, who were social workers, who were administrators, we were gay professional men in New York, and we took all of those skills and applied it to developing this infrastructure. So gay guys who had AIDS, who were lawyers, developed legal service programs for people with AIDS at GMHC. That was Jay Lipner. Educators developed education programs. Communicate, the advertising people, and you see that in ACT UP as much as at GMHC. ACT UP was full of guys who did publicity work. And so they sold Coca-Cola and Madonna for a living. So they sold ACT UP instead, and they were incredibly effective at it. The logos, the visuals, the demonstrations were never large. They were just really well-planned theater. So that they looked larger than they were. The impact was bigger than the crowd size. So I think that first wave of that volunteering was like, let's take these skills we have and put them to work. And then, as I said, we were faced with a total mystery that was terrifying. We were faced with a total mystery that was terrifying. So I think that first wave of that volunteering was like, let's take these skills we have and put them to work. And then, as I said, we were faced with a total mystery that was terrifying. We were faced with a total mystery that was terrifying. So I think that first wave of that volunteering was like, let's take these skills we have and put them to work. then I think certainly what I said before, that everybody was scared and isolated and didn't know what to do, and coming together and volunteering in whatever capacity you could do it. Right. So for some people, that meant I'm going to be a lawyer in the legal services department. For other people, it meant I'm going to be a buddy and I'm going to buy groceries for somebody, or I'm going to take people to the doctor. And for other people, it meant I'm going to stuff condoms in a pack, or I'm going to answer the hotline. There were so many different kinds of tasks, and people gravitated towards what they felt comfortable with and where their abilities were. But it provided everybody with this sort of safe place and a home and a chance to do something that allowed you to feel like you could respond to the terror. So the volunteering was not merely isn't the right word, because but was not merely, I'm here to help this person, I'm doing this charitable service. It was, I'm here to help myself get through this time by finding a place where I can feel useful and safe. And so there was a selfish motive to the volunteering. And, we're here to help one another, and that's how I can help and save myself. And I think that was a really important piece of it. And and it didn't matter, like, it wasn't like, oh, the lawyer volunteers were more important than the condom stuffers. It was all equally important. It all needed to be done. The other piece of this is, it was terrible, right? It was terrible. People were, it wasn't, and it wasn't as if there was any sort of separation between, particularly in the early days, and I want to talk about this more later, but in the beginning, first bunch, 5 years or more, there was no demarcation between I'm the worker and I'm the client, right? We were all the same thing. And because half of the, more than half of the volunteers and the staff either, had AIDS or were at risk, and we all knew it. So, it wasn't as if these clients were the other, they get served. That changed. And that, we'll hopefully get to that in this discussion, but that changed, and it was the downfall to me of GMHC. But, the heart of the AIDS movement was that it was led by people with AIDS. And that was incredibly unique. You want to look at examples in public health of getting people involved in responding to a health crisis. AIDS is incredibly unique in that the response was led, we weren't an addition, we started it. The government didn't start it, industry didn't start it, the public health establishment didn't respond to the crisis. People with AIDS responded to the crisis. And, you can define that broadly as people who were actually infected, people who were very much at risk, people who were very affected because it was their loved ones and their families, right? We were, we ran it. And I can't think of any other example in public health where that has been the case. It was really profound. So the horror was constant. It was your coworker got sick and is no longer your coworker because now he's in the hospital and he needs a buddy. Or, oh, I just tested positive. The person who's doing the testing counseling just tested positive, or, oh, the person I work next to died. And that was constant. So there was no moment to stop and say, oh my God, this is terrible. You know, you go to the memorial service and it would be sad and everybody would cry, and then you'd go back to work. And then the next day it would happen again. And it didn't, and so the work just became, you know, there wasn't no time to grieve. You just had to keep pushing on, and you had to sort of do it, particularly, you know, up until 96, you sort of had to keep doing it, knowing that no matter how hard you worked, it wasn't going to work, right? It wasn't, you know, you were making things better for people, but only so much. We couldn't stop people from, you know, we could prolong life a little bit finally after a little while, but we couldn't really save anybody. And more people would get infected. So you had to keep working under that kind of pressure and that kind of sense of, you know, constant disappointment that you couldn't look at. You couldn't think about it because it would just be too devastating, and then you couldn't go on. GMHC, I think, to some degree, had a little more space in its culture for a mix of emotional response. ACT UP had none. ACT UP had, there was one emotion and two emotions at ACT UP that were permitted. One was anger, and the second one was a sense of sort of joy and camaraderie when we would play together. But there was no grief. There was no time, and it was a sign of weakness. It was looked down upon. I don't think anybody. That was never said, but it didn't need to be said. So I don't know. I think that begins to answer some of that question.
Yeah. Yeah. So as you kind of look back at the impact of GMHC in that early period, you know, say to the time you were there, the early mid-90s, what's your take on the organization? And then maybe that's also a bridge in.
Wait, I'm going to turn my video off because now you're lagging.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what's your take on the balance sheet, the track record, the accomplishments of the organization in that period? And then we sort of hinted at it. What went wrong, if something went wrong, and when did it go wrong?
Well, first of all, the accomplishments were like unbelievably vast, right? Incredibly great. Because the GMHC model became a model that was adopted all over the world, you know, in different ways. And, you know, it changed for different places, but you know, I'm not talking just the US. I'm talking all over the world. Is that model was, you know, started at GMHC. So that's one. Two, we created the notion of prevention and safer sex, and, you know, saved a lot of lives that way. It was nowhere near what it needed to be, but it was all we had, and it was an incredibly risky strategy. Remember that GMHC started promoting safer sex and the use of condoms before we knew there was a virus and before we knew how the virus was transmitted. So condoms might not have been effective at all. So it was a totally risky thing to do. We were lucky, right? But that it was right. But then promoting this notion of safer sex, you know, to a community that was totally distrustful of public health institutional messages saying don't have sex, because they were always telling us not to have sex, right? So, they were putting us in jail and putting us in mental institutions. So why should we listen to them when they say don't have sex? So we found a way to keep ourselves and each other safe, but in a way that we wouldn't have to give up our sexual freedom. Was an enormous, right, an enormous accomplishment that, again, replicated all over the world and still an important part of HIV prevention. And it really wasn't until we got, it really wasn't until, what year was it? 2011, 2012, 2013, that we found out that treatment effectively prevents somebody from infecting others. And it wasn't until several years after that that we knew that people who were uninfected could take treatment as a prophylaxis, right? So those are the two most effective prevention methods that we have. All we had before that was safer sex, and that was GMHC. So, those are pretty good accomplishments. The policy work at ACT UP gets an awful lot of attention for the way that it did policy and advocacy work, but GMHC's policy work was incredibly important. We just did it differently. We were the insiders, and you needed the insider-outsider strategy for the thing to work. And ACT UP was really focused on certain kinds of institutions, but GMHC was focused on City Hall and the State House, and appropriations in Congress, anti-discrimination laws. So the advocacy work, I think, also was incredibly important that GMHC did during that period, and helped establish the Ryan White Care Act and the implementation of the Ryan White programs. I mean, the drugs themselves saved people's lives, but without that infrastructure, the drugs wouldn't have gotten to anybody, right? So that infrastructure saved all those lives along with the pills. So that's a pretty good accomplishment. Where did it go wrong? I don't know anything about GMHC now, so I can't tell you what they do. I'm pretty immersed in AIDS work. That I can't tell you what they do tells you a lot about the agency, right? I haven't seen a press release from GMHC. I haven't gotten an email. I haven't seen anything. They certainly haven't been front and center on anything in terms of advocacy work. Maybe they're providing some good services in that building. I have no idea. But how did it change? It changed. There were a bunch of factors that led to the change. One, it got bigger and bigger and bigger. So just managing, 10,000 volunteers, all doing different programs, providing a whole array of services, a couple of hundred meals every single day, legal services, ombudsman services, prevention, plus all the advocacy work. I mean, you look at GMHC in the 90s, we were 3 different agencies under one roof. We were an advocacy organization, we were an education prevention organization, and we were a service provider for people with AIDS. And there was a lot of overlap, but they were really 3 different cultures, 3 different ways of working that, so in some ways it was a victim of its own success. It got too big. But as it got bigger and the staff grew and grew, the need to sort of create hierarchy and the need to really professionalize things, that became a goal, that's what had to happen. We had to professionalize GMHC. And that, maybe there was no way around that. I don't know. I think that there was, but the more the services became professionalized, the more the people who provided those services, were not just, oh, how can I help? But I have this degree and I'm looking for this job, and now the job is posted and I can get a job and it'll pay me well, and I'll get some benefits, and I will be a professional in, instead of working at, I don't know, United Way or a hospital or something, they could work at GMHC. So, and the professionals were very tied to their professionalism. And that created this rift, this gap between, I'm the person who provides the service and you're the person I provide the service to. And the clients became others. And there was no longer real leadership among people with AIDS at GMHC. There was no real requirement that people with AIDS, make up a certain percentage of the staff, a certain percentage of the board. There were still plenty of people with AIDS working at GMHC, but that no longer was a priority, or just a sort of an organic, that no longer was the organic piece that GMHC, that created the agency in the first place. We became a professionalized agency, and we lost a lot because of that. Maybe the services got better. Maybe we were able to provide more services to more people, I guess. But so that was good, but we lost something. And that was a shame to me.
David, did that happen while you were there, or did it happen after you left?
It started to happen while I was there. You could see it happening. And then after I left, I mean, not because I left, but because that shift was just inevitable at that point. And yeah, and the sort of really grassrootsy people, they either got sick and died or they moved on, and who replaced them were, oh, you're a trained educator, and you're a trained social worker, and that became what was valued, that sense of professionalism. And I think, and that wasn't just GMHC, that happened across the AIDS movement, in particularly within the service providing organizations.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I could like jump to the next place.
Yeah, go for it.
But maybe you have what? All right. So
where are you going to go? I was going to ask a little bit about for some stories of your time at GMHC that stand out for you because of political impact or their emotional impact, or just, to get a few, but we can do that later, wherever you want to go.
All right, let me talk about this first, because it kind of relates to the other, and then I can tell you all kinds of stuff. So I said that there were sort of like 3 different agencies and 3 different cultures, and the advocacy work and the policy work was we were very sort of separated from the service delivery. We were informed by the service delivery. I talked to those people all the time, so I was informed about what's going on, et cetera. What's happening with your clients, what are their problems right now, or here's stuff you need to know. There's this change in policy. There's this new money coming down that's going to be a new program. You guys need to know how to tap into this. There's a new drug. You need to learn about the treatment stuff. So there was a lot of that kind of back and forth. But and this will lead to a story. It was difficult to engage the service providers and the prevention staff in engaging in the advocacy and activism. ACT UP could get people out on the street. So when I needed to get people out on the street, I was in my ACT UP hat. I couldn't get GMHC out on the street. That was not something they would do. They were great at doing AIDS walk. You could get thousands of people out, but it was a fundraiser. Dance-a-thon, it was a fundraiser. You could get a crew of people to do sort of a day of lobbying in Albany or Washington, but you couldn't do much more than that. So there was definitely a gap between sort of what we were trying to do on the advocacy side and what the service providers were willing to do. And that was really a shame and a problem. They spent their days really differently than I did. When I moved over to the treatment education and advocacy department, I started doing services along with the advocacy work. And I learned a lot, like I learned, oh, services are a bitch and they're really hard to do. And advocacy, it's all like big ideas and got to do this now. And service, it's all like, I have to schedule the room and I have to get the copies. And it's all this little fiddly stuff that is a total pain in the ass. And it was interesting to like learn, oh, okay, that's what they deal with. They're scheduling clients all the time and the client is having a crisis and you have to respond to it right away. And so it was hard for them to think about, oh yeah, I should get involved in this advocacy too. So I understand why it was difficult, but it was a shame that we couldn't get them more involved. Housing Works was able to do that. They were able to get their clients and their volunteers and their staff involved in advocacy and out on the street. But this is a good point to segue to a story. It was 92, and I had just lost a very close friend, and ACT UP's demonstrations were fine, but we never got more than 1,000 people out. And I said, we need 50,000 people out on the street. And how do we do that? And it was 92, and the Democratic Convention was in New York that summer. So there was an event coming up that was, going to bring all the media to New York. And so I made a proposal to Tim, who was the executive director, and said, why don't we form a coalition and organize a large demonstration in New York to demand, what the next president needs to do about AIDS. And that became United for AIDS Action. And so GMH and Tim said, oh, that's a good idea. Let's do that. And so that sort of became my life for a while. And, GMHC we had a lot of money then. And a lot of that money was raised from individuals, and major donors. So all the government money was tied to programs. You could only use the money to perform these services, but the individual dollars, you could do anything you wanted with them. And we had a lot of them. And so a lot of that money went into the advocacy work. Full page ads in the New York Times. GMHC did them again and again and again. And the ACT UP could never afford anything like that. So Tim said, let's do this and I'll get you the budget. And so we put together, and the idea was that we would form a coalition. The coalition would, it included ACT UP, but it would really be a way to sort of bring aid service providers and others into the arena of doing a street action. And so we formed this coalition, and it hadn't been done before. And we formed a coalition. Eventually, we had well over 400 groups signed on, all the aid service organizations, churches, unions, the healthcare workers union. It was very, very broad, along with ACT UP. And ACTIP was a problem because in order to do the demonstration with that large of a coalition and with that group of people, where we wanted to bring clients and staff and volunteers out onto the street, it couldn't look like an ACTIP demo, right? It wasn't civil, it couldn't be civil disobedience. People had to be safe. Nobody was going to get arrested. That's not what this was going to be. This needed to look different. It needed to be safer and more mainstream. And so we formed the coalition, and the first thing the coalition did, I was the coordinator. So the first thing we did was we developed like a 10-point plan of what the next president should do on AIDS. And we sent it to all of the then candidates on the Republican. This was before there was, while the primaries were still going on. So we sent it to all the candidates, and we requested meetings with all of them. George Bush never got back to us, of course. Jerry Brown maybe got back to us and then disappeared. But the guy who got back to us and said, let's meet, was Bill Clinton. And we didn't, we knew who he was but nobody really knew who he was. It was early. And we also didn't think he had any chance of winning the election because New Hampshire had just happened, and there was the bust up about Jennifer Flowers. What was her name? I don't remember, but it was the first affair, right? And we thought, oh, this guy's dead in the water, but he wasn't, and he agreed to meet with us. So we met with him, and in setting up and Clinton was really the first presidential candidate to develop a relationship with the gay community. He raised lots of money from gay guys, and nobody else really had tried to do that before. And so he had the Human Rights Campaign, in his pocket, and he had this guy, David Mixner, who was raising all this money, and it was all David Geffen, it was all these A-list gay guys. And so the Clinton campaign called up and said, well, let's organize this meeting. And I had this coalition of AIDS organizations, some of which were gay and some of which were not. We were an AIDS coalition, not a gay and lesbian rights group. And so Clinton's people said, well, we're going to bring all these other people to the meeting, Human Rights Campaign, and And I said, if you bring those people to the meeting, we're not coming. And they couldn't understand why that would be, but we were a very diverse coalition of, Black, Latino, gay, straight, drug users, etc. And we knew that if Clinton walked in with all these white, rich gay guys, the coalition would blow, and all the trust would be gone. So we said no, and they said, okay, fine. And then we ended up meeting with Clinton. And it was kind of this wild meeting because we were very, very well. We planned it very well. We had a whole bunch of questions, and each person was given a question. There were about 25 of the coalition members who went to the meeting, 20 people maybe. I opened the meeting by handing him GMHC condom packs. And remember, Jennifer Flowers had just happened. So that was the news on Clinton. And I handed him the condom packs, and he took them and he said, oh, imagine if the press saw I had these. And I said, well, imagine if the press thought you didn't have them. And it was like the only moment where he kind of lost the beat and turned white. But he was remarkable. He'd never handed the question off to somebody else. Every question in detail. He knew his stuff. And we were like, who the hell is this guy? And we had one concrete demand because we didn't know, whether he was going to become the candidate or not. And we had one concrete demand, which was that he had to make a major address on AIDS during his campaign. And he didn't miss a beat. And he said, well, I'll do that if you guys write it for me. And we went, oh, okay. And we actually did. We wrote the speech and he gave that speech. And so that led to the demonstration. We did United for AIDS Action in Times Square in July. There were about 40,000 people. It was the largest AIDS demonstration ever. We marched from Columbus Circle down to Times Square. We had, and because it wasn't an ACT UP demonstration, the mayor spoke, Jesse Jackson spoke, Dennis Rivera, who's the head of the Health and Hospitals Union, spoke. We had celebrities speaking, and we had they gave us the Jumbotron so that everybody could see, it was like, we worked with the police ahead of time. ACT UP had a fit, they were just so angry at the way that it all happened. They were there and they had a big fight with the police and they were furious at us for the way we did it. But we did it and it got really good coverage. And that night, a person living with AIDS, Bob Hattoy, spoke on the floor of the Democratic Convention and AIDS became an issue. So that was, and there were GMHC clients. There were clients from all these service organizations and volunteers from all these service organizations out on the street. And that was the goal, was to get them out there, and that worked. We weren't able to continue it. The coalition was able to hold together around a specific event, but maintaining it beyond that event was too hard. And so we really couldn't continue that. But, that was a stab at trying to bring those two ends of the work together. And it was a good one.
That's an awesome story. I actually had not heard that story before, and I have not really read about it and the stuff that I've looked at. Thank you for that. That's amazing. Yeah, and you've kind of covered a lot of this material. Is there any other strategic moment in your time at GMHC that you want to lift up? Like this was one, I think, what you just talked about, the decision to go ahead and throw down on the Democratic Convention, but any others leap to mind?
Yeah, a different kind of story and a different kind of example, I think, because the treatment education work that we did, I think also was pretty, we weren't the only ones doing it, but we were the ones who, it was really us and Project Inform in San Francisco who started that work. And starting at the beginning, nobody knew anything, right? So my doctor didn't know any more than I did, because there wasn't that much to know, and everything was anecdotal. And there was all kinds of information and misinformation swirling around. So we created, and GMHC was really in the forefront on the East Coast of creating an infrastructure to sort of handle and disseminate information and get rid of the misinformation. And that, so here's some new drug that people are trying. Here's how to get it. Here are the signs and symptoms of these opportunistic infections. Here are new ways that we've found to prevent getting those opportunistic infections. All of that stuff was patient-led. And, again, a good example of, professionals just becoming the volunteers. Who started the newsletter treatment issues at GMHC was Dr. Barry Gingell. So he was a doctor, and with AIDS, he was dead by the time I got there in 1990. But we really created all of this infrastructure for people to learn about treatment, how to keep yourself well, how to, what to do about this drug, how to handle these side effects. And that was, and it took lots of different forms. And remember, no internet, right? no internet. So there were leaflets. We created fact sheets. We translated the fact sheets into 5 different languages. We had to make sure they were accurate, so we had to run them past doctors to make sure everything was correct. I was running, and the staff in the treatment education department, we were running workshops, 2-3 times a week, basic workshops. What is AIDS treatment? What opportunistic infection workshops. We ran a treatment library where people could come in and get counseling on their specific issues and read up on everything that was available. We put out treatment issues, the newsletter, every month. It was out for years and years and years, and it was treatment issues. It was just this newsletter that we wrote, but everything was checked by the volunteer doctors who were working alongside us, and it was a major source of information, not just for GMHC clients and individuals, but for doctors and healthcare providers, because they could get the information faster that way before it got published in some peer-reviewed journal. So it was, that was a pretty unique situation there, that we were providing this kind of information for lay people, providing it for lay people. And our approach in the treatment education work was that very often, and this, again, this became the global model, that peers could often provide this information to other peers better than their doctor could. Because you're nervous when you see the doctor. I'm like, I know my treatment stuff inside and out, and I'm an idiot when I go into my doctor's office. I forget all my questions and I forget what he says, particularly back then. And you're scared to ask the doctor questions and to challenge the doctor when he says something that you're not sure is right. So we developed a peer-based model for doing this treatment education and counseling work that, again, got replicated. My friends are doing it in India, and they're doing it in Russia, and they're doing it in China, and they're doing it in Brazil, but that's where it started. And that stuff really also bridged sort of the services advocacy divide, because you needed that, everybody needed to know that medical information to be a good advocate, but also to be a successful patient. So it served multiple purposes. Yeah, so I think that's another good example.
That's a great example. You've alluded to this already, or you've really talked about it, but what changed for white middle-class gay men through the AIDS crisis and through the engagement with GMHC, and how do you, I think you were there during some of these shifts. How did race, class, gender play out in GMHC specifically in terms of the population, the approach, dynamics over the time you were there?
Yeah. Well, I don't, I think it's true, certainly true, that GMHC was started by a group of, middle class, sometimes upper middle class, upper class white gay men. But the agency was, and that was a large part of the clientele, and that community was certainly a large part of the clientele, the volunteers, and the staff. But GMHC was not just providing services to, but providing services by people of color, certainly very much so by the time I got there in 1990. There were a lot of women working there, a lot of lesbians working there. But the board was primarily white gay men, though there was a lot of money people on the board, and they weren't all gay. Like thank God for Joan Tish and Judy Peabody and those wonderfully wealthy women. The so and there was no question really that GMHC came out of a white gay community, but I really don't think it's fair to say that its work was limited to the people in that community. We were directly serving over, at its height, we were directly providing services to over 30,000 people with AIDS in New York City, and tens of thousands more with prevention. And, a large percentage of those people were people of color. And the programs that, that were developed through the advocacy of GMHC and others, not just GMHC alone, like the Ryan White Care Act, provided essential services to communities of color and still do. But was there that tension in the agency? Yes, absolutely. And in that the white voices were the louder voices, the more privileged voices were more comfortable being louder, were more comfortable around the money people, were more likely to be professionals sometimes because they had better access to education and college degrees. So there was definitely that tension. And because the services, the health services, and the distrust of health services within communities of color was so, the distrust was so high and the services were so much worse. The Black gay leadership died a lot faster. And, we lost a generation after generation of Black gay leadership. We lost white gay leadership too, but not to the same degree. There weren't as many Black voices, and they died faster. So we lost some really, really key people who were providing leadership, and that made it so much harder for Black gay communities to organize because they kept losing the leadership. And the organizations, the Minority Task Force, the Hispanic AIDS Forum, the sort of organizations developed within and by communities of color didn't have access to the same kind of money that GMHC had access to. So they were always scrambling ways that GMHC wasn't. And they were much more dependent on government and foundation money, which always came with strings to programs. So they were less able to fund advocacy work. They were less able to say, oh, we want to create this program and try it out and see what happens. Instead, it was, well, this is the program you're going to do because this is the way CDC wants you to do it. And you don't get the money otherwise, So the racial disparity was intense. And same with gender, maybe even more so, because I can think of lots of Black and Latino gay men who moved through GMHC as volunteers and as staff, and who played important roles there. But I can't really think of any women with AIDS who played that role at GMHC. There were lots of women who worked there, but they weren't women with AIDS. And I think that ended up getting, that impacted the way that GMHC provided services to women. Women were always the other. How did our lives change? Well, some of us survived. So that's probably the first most important, piece. Any of us, all of us who survived came out of it really damaged, in ways that we didn't really recognize until later. This idea that, this inability to grieve, to sort of pack all that away, didn't mean it went away, and it kept leaking out, I think, for people in all kinds of really destructive ways. Crystal meth use and alcohol and isolation and loneliness and depression. And I think there's a terrible feeling of abandonment among older, the gay men who lived through that time, just feeling like the gay community has abandoned us. They don't acknowledge that they don't know, the younger generations don't really know what we went through. They don't know what we did. We created infrastructure within gay communities all over the country, all over the world. If there would be no gay marriage without the AIDS response, because it created the infrastructure that got us to that place. So all of the progress, that we've seen, that may all go away soon, but all of the progress that we've seen, comes out of the organizing that we did in the AIDS movement, and the women's rights and women's health movements. But out of the AIDS movement, not only because it created infrastructure, but because it gave us this sense of, oh my God, look at what the fuck we can do. Look at what we did. Really, like, I don't know, the US response, volunteer response in World War II, that was pretty formidable. The AIDS response in the 80s and 90s, give me another example that is as good as, as strong as that one. Equal to the civil rights movement. So it certainly changed those of us who lived through it. It changed the quality of life for everybody who came after.
Yes, I agree with that. David, this is kind of an incredible interview. Is there anything I haven't asked you, or that you want to say that I didn't ask a question that allowed you to say?
Tim Sweeney is God.
Can you say a few more sentences about
really,
that? He may turn out to be a character in this chapter, so I'd love for you to expand on that. Like, say more about that.
Well, I don't know. Tim was just like, Tim went through hell and managed to like rise above all the time. When I would feel like I can't do this anymore, I just looked to Tim. So Tim's doing it, so I have to. So his perseverance, but also his incredibly good humor. Like I like we're sarcastic, nasty guys. That's like part of our defense mechanism. That's not Tim. Tim's just a sweetheart. And Tim is the opposite of Larry. And he was pragmatic. It was, how do we get something accomplished? Not how do I vent my anger, but how do I get something done? He never lost that focus. And and calmed everybody else down. And he was just a joy to be with. And he was always smart, like his take on the politics was always right. And like, I never agree with anybody. So, what else? It's the GMHC story is an amazing story, and nobody's told it.
I agree.
You know, like I loved ACT UP. It changed my life. It was great work. But, you know, what, 3 movies, 4 books, you know, ACT UP was 3 years of time, 4 years. That was it. Started in 87. People will say ACT UP continued through the 90s. ACT UP was done by 92. And, you know, the treatment activists all left in 91. We all left. We quit. We formed another organization. So, you know, the ACT UP story is great, and there's all this footage. So that's why there's movies, because there's coverage, you know, and there's stuff you can show, and it's very dramatic and looks great in the film. But the GMAC story is a much deeper story, and nobody's told it. Nobody. And, you know, I'm glad you're doing a chapter, but somebody ought to do the book before, you know, we're not around anymore.
I'm totally
That's
there.
a clock that's ticking, really.
I'm totally there. I'm shocked at how little there is.
Yeah, there's nothing.
No. Well, we'll try and do it justice, and I hope it's okay if we might come back to you for a small thing or two along the way as we get into writing this summer.
You figured out that I like to talk, right?
Well, you're a great talker. I mean, these are amazing stories, and we got some stuff out of this that I have not heard before. So I'm super grateful to you, and I hope, you know, I'm always a little concerned about doing these. Like, how is it going to be for people to come back down this path? To remember this stuff, but it sounds like for you, it's
Who else did Tim tell you to talk to?
I won't get all the names, but I think we're talking to David Hansel, maybe? Is that one?
David Hansel. David's
Hansel?
great to talk to.
Yeah. And then
Jeff Levy.
Jeff Levy. There's another person he
Who
recommended.
wasn't at GMHC.
No, that was more of a broader kind of view on what was going on. Those were the 3 he recommended.
Can I make a couple of other recommendations that would be more
Yeah.
GMHC specific?
Yeah. Please.
I would definitely talk to Daniel Wolf, who worked at the communications department and also was deeply involved in ACT UP. So there's that bridge again. And Daniel is just an amazing guy. You'd love talking to him. I would talk to Greg Bordowitz, who is an artist and a filmmaker and a poet and a, you know, pretty well known. But Greg was also very involved in ACT UP, but on staff at GMHC, and with Giancarlo Musto ran the audio visual department, right? Like, we had all this money. So GMHC had a video studio, right?
Yeah.
And again, no internet, right? So the videos were an incredibly important way. And, you know, the video cameras were big, cumbersome things. There were no phone cameras, right? So the videos that they made were really, really, and, you know, if you've seen How to Survive a Plague, all that stuff, that's Greg's footage. And they made a whole series of really great videos for GMHC, and ran a weekly cable TV show for GMHC. And so I think Greg would be a good person to talk to. And the other person I'm trying to think of like different roles. So one other person that I think would be great to speak to is a woman named Patricia Everett. Patricia worked in the fundraising department, and without Patricia, there'd be no AIDS walk, there'd be no dance-a-thon, there'd be like GMHC did all these amazing events, and the events always served 2 purposes, right? They were fundraisers, and they were successful fundraisers, but they were community mobilization events. And some of them were, you know, remarkable. Music for Life, and it was Leonard Bernstein and Stephen Sondheim and you know, opera stars, and it was really big deal stuff. For them at that time to come out and do AIDS stuff was groundbreaking, you know. And so those events, the circus event, she'll tell you about that. I mean, those events were very unique and really did serve these dual purposes of bringing people into the community of GMHC and raising the money. And that was all Patricia. So it's another aspect of the volunteering that's a little bit different, but I think it was an important one.
I'm sensing it's very important. Would you send me their emails, David, if you have them? Otherwise, I can track them down. That would be great. And yeah, and thank you for all the great work you've done and do. It's really moving.
David.
Sure, it's a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you so much. We'll be back in touch. Take it easy. Thank you.
Bye.